The river had always moved steadily, carrying logs and rafts, feeding small farms and the families who clung to the soil of Illinois with bare hands and stubborn hope. But in 1841, its waters were bent into something different. The new mill rose from its banks like a fortress, its wheel turning with unbroken rhythm, creaking but powerful, drawing eyes from miles away. Farmers came to see it with awe, their children staring as though it were a cathedral built not for God but for industry. And perhaps it was, for inside those walls was a man who smiled like a saint, spoke like a benefactor, and thought only of how easily men and women might be bent to his will when they believed they were being saved. He called himself a servant of progress, a patriot who would bring prosperity to their isolated town. Yet every beam and every bolt in that mill was chosen with more than efficiency in mind. The man's name spread quickly, spoken with trust by those who did not see the tremor in his eyes when the machinery ground its first grain. To the townsfolk he was a gentleman dressed in dark coats, attending Sunday services without fail, bowing his head with practiced humility. To the orphans in the parish he was a benefactor who handed out warm loaves of bread baked from flour that carried the smell of oil and steel. To the mayor he was a partner in the vision of modern Illinois, building a community where men would work in shifts and coin would flow. Yet behind the polished veneer of generosity, his journals whispered of something different. He wrote not of wages and progress, but of obedience and yield, of the strange satisfaction he felt watching gears crush grain, and the way his heart stirred at the thought of flesh caught in those same wheels. His mind did not divide labor from punishment. In his thoughts, both were the same. When the first workers entered the mill, their faces lit with relief that hunger might finally be eased. None noticed the way he stood at the door, not welcoming them but measuring them. He studied shoulders, hands, and gait the way a butcher might appraise livestock. Each worker's name was marked in his ledger, not only for wages but for qualities he would later consider: endurance, silence, fear. He took note of the young girl who crossed herself before touching the loom, the old man whose fingers twitched as though already injured, the boy who hummed while sweeping grain. To the town, these were common quirks. To him, they were threads to be pulled when the time came. He smiled at them all, speaking of honest pay and honest work. But in his chest, his heart quickened at the thought of how easily trust could be broken, how devotion could be turned to despair. The mill itself was built with care that went beyond function. Hidden chambers lined its underbelly, narrow corridors where sound would travel and multiply, turning whispers into echoes that seemed like chants. Trapdoors were fitted into lofts, not for grain, but for watching. Chains hung in storerooms where rope would have sufficed. The very walls were layered thick, muffling screams so that the sound would remain within the stone. To those who passed outside, the hum of the wheel was steady, soothing, a heartbeat of prosperity. To him it was a veil, a perfect mask behind which to test how long a human body might endure in silence before breaking. He saw himself not as cruel but as chosen, as though the river itself had offered him its endless patience. The mill wheel spinning as his metronome, its rotations counting not hours of labor but the seconds between a first breath and a last. The first months were calm, and the town praised him without restraint. Families told their children that he was a man of God's design, someone who would keep them from starvation. He did not need to act otherwise. His mask of innocence was perfect. But already his nights were spent walking the silent floors after workers had gone, trailing his fingers along the wooden beams, feeling the vibrations of the machines in his palms, imagining those same vibrations tearing into skin. He believed he was not merely a man but an architect of a new form of order, where labor and suffering were inseparable, where control could be made flesh. His journals grew heavier with entries, sketched diagrams of harnesses, notes on weight and pulley, as though he were writing scripture. He saw the mill as a body, each worker an organ and himself its brain, deciding which parts might be cut away for the whole to remain alive. No one saw the shadows of his mind. Mothers sent their sons to him. Wives kissed their husbands goodbye at the door of the mill, never thinking that its owner's smile was not welcome but warning. At church, his prayers were whispered with conviction, yet even as he murmured to God, his thoughts were of how easily hymns might be drowned out by the hiss of steam or the crush of a press. To him, religion was not salvation but a language of ritual, and he intended to make rituals of his own. His devotion was to control, to the perfection of fear. And though no blood had yet been spilled in open sight, the mill itself was already steeped in a different kind of violence. The violence of silence, of trust placed into hands that had no intention of keeping it safe. The wheel turned, and with each rotation his heart grew steadier, his purpose clearer. The town celebrated its new prosperity, blind to the shadow spreading quietly beneath their feet. They admired the mill's efficiency, spoke of how it made their community strong, while behind its thick walls their benefactor dreamed of sacrifices that would bind that strength forever. The workers laughed together at the end of shifts, their backs aching but their pockets heavier, unaware that their lives were being measured not in years but in rotations of the great wheel. The mill never rested, and neither did he. Its rhythm carried into the night, and as the water churned steadily through the wheel, it sounded to him like a voice promising what no scripture dared admit, that flesh could be ground as easily as grain, and that no one would ever question where the missing handfuls had gone. And so the mill stood, doors open wide, a beacon of progress on the Illinois frontier. It drew men, women, and children into its belly, promising bread and coin, hiding the ledger where their names had already been marked. No one yet understood that the river fed more than grain into those turning wheels. It was only the beginning, and the mill would keep running long after the workers themselves had stopped. He was always the first to arrive at Sunday service, his boots polished, coat pressed, hat clutched respectfully to his chest as the church bell rang across the quiet fields. To the congregation he was a gift from Providence, a man of means who asked for nothing but gave freely. He donated sacks of flour to widows, funded hymn books for the choir, and handed out blankets at the orphanage during the long Illinois winters. The priest praised him by name in sermons, calling him a steward of both industry and virtue. He never missed a funeral, always stood in quiet reverence, and sometimes wept, though no one ever asked why. He knelt at the altar, bowed his head during communion, and offered his hand to every grieving mother like a man who had known sorrow too. No one saw that his grief was something else entirely. The politician sought him out next. The mayor wrote his name into official letters as a shining example of civic leadership. Doctors traveling westward stopped to admire his machines, praising his workshops for cleanliness, ventilation, and efficiency. Unaware that he had guided their tours away from the doors that were never meant to be opened. They said he was ahead of his time, quoting European minds like Spurzheim and Gall, who linked skull shapes to human worth, unaware that the mill owner had read those same names not for enlightenment, but for domination. He subscribed to journals from England and Prussia, articles dissecting pain thresholds, psychological conditioning, and the usefulness of fear in shaping behavior. These were not curiosities to him, they were blueprints. His study, though no one was ever permitted to enter, was lined with anatomical drawings not hung like trophies but ordered like commandments. Books bound in calfskin bore titles not spoken in polite company. Volumes on dissection from Vienna, execution rituals from Paris, punishment chambers used in mental asylums in Bavaria. He did not read them with horror, but with awe. What fascinated him most were not the screams, but the limits, how far sinew could stretch before snapping, how many degrees of heat before a mind collapsed. He did not imagine pain as chaos, but as data. He believed in design, that suffering, when organized properly, became a language no man could lie through. He wrote in neat, controlled lines across his journals late into the night, oil lamp flickering as he translated flesh into formula. He described his workers not as people, but as units. The young ones were elastic gear, flexible and quick to learn. The older ones were hardened joints, prone to wear but good for weight-bearing. He diagrammed shifts the way an engineer diagrams engines, noting which combinations of personalities yielded the least rebellion. He recorded which tasks left men too tired to argue and which induced just enough pride to blind them to their own slow disintegration. Each day was an experiment, and every smile he gave in town was a variable controlled. There was one worker, a boy of 17, who asked too many questions about the storage rooms behind the grinding floor. The owner watched him quietly for a week, noting his gait, his meal times, the way he scribbled poetry in the margins of burlap delivery sacks. Then the boy was reassigned to the night shift alone. When he failed to return home 3 days later, his mother was told he had fled town. A staged letter was left in her mailbox, poorly forged in the boy's hand, claiming dreams of the city and better wages. She cried into the mill owner's coat when he came to comfort her, never seeing the smile that flickered when she whispered, "He was always too clever for this town." What remained of the boy was later boiled down in the bone vat beneath the mill. The owner documented the process as a success. His notes recorded the hours it took for teeth to dissolve and how steam exposure affected the curvature of ribs. He wrote that creative minds made for more resilient fiber. The ink did not smudge as he wrote it. He used words like humane when speaking to the mayor, scientific when hosting the traveling doctors. He hosted a supper for a physician from Boston who marveled at the order of his facilities and clinked glasses with him beneath chandeliers purchased from a European glassmaker. They toasted to the future of mechanized labor while the walls above them sweated from the heat of the secret rooms where straps and steel tools were scrubbed clean by mute apprentices who had never known any other life. He did not laugh often, but when he did, it came at the strangest times. When a gear jammed and crushed the fingers of a worker who had spoken out the week before, or when the pastor thanked him for his contributions to the moral fabric of the town. To him, these were not coincidences. They were signs that his designs were working. Obedience came faster after blood. Productivity rose when eyes saw what silence could prevent. He believed he was building more than a business. He believed he was building order out of chaos, a human system that would run without question like the river that turned his great wheel. And still, no one suspected. They praised his kindness, admired his discipline, asked him to speak at town meetings about the virtues of routine and responsibility. When he did, he spoke with warmth, recounting stories of his childhood on the East Coast, the hardship of losing his family, and the sacred duty he felt to honor their legacy by bringing labor to the people. He ended each speech with the same phrase, "We build so we may endure." But what he built was not merely a mill, it was a machine of submission. And what he endured was not hardship, but the thrill of knowing that no one could see the monster beneath the manners. He shook hands with the priest, bowed to the mayor, kissed babies on the forehead as their mothers beamed, all while cataloging which of their limbs would resist the blade the longest. The town still saw a savior, but beneath the charity and sermons a darker scripture was already being written, one flesh at a time. She was just 17 and small for her age, but her hands moved quickly over the cloth sacks and iron bolts that lined the wheelroom. Her name was Elsie. She wore her father's coat most nights, sleeves rolled twice over and hem trailing behind her like a curtain. The others liked her. She smiled more than most, sang hymns when the belts weren't too loud, and always offered her bread crust to the boy who swept the floor behind her. She was quiet, not out of fear but out of softness, and that softness made her stand out. The mill owner noticed it long before she did. He watched how she moved with care, how she placed each tool back in its exact slot, how she stepped around the rats instead of kicking them. He wrote it in his book. Compliant, unassuming, no father on record, baptized, possible subject. The town was used to long hours and night shifts, especially in winter when the river ran thick and the wheel turned slower. That night the lamps had burned low and the silence after shift change was heavy. Elsie had been alone for 2 hours before the other workers arrived, and when they did, her station was empty. Her apron still hung on the nail. Her bread sat untouched in the tin. The wheel turned on. No alarm was raised. The supervisor shrugged and said she'd likely gone home sick. The owner shook his head solemnly in public and asked if someone might check with her neighbors. But he knew exactly where she was. He had brought her there himself. Below the mill floor, past the trapdoor hidden beneath a stack of flour barrels, was a chamber lit only by the pulse of a furnace and the thin light from slits carved into the wall. She was suspended there, not lying down, not upright, but locked into a position designed to keep her conscious. Her back bent, arms splayed behind her like wings snapped mid-flight, legs weighted with iron shoes. Her chest was exposed just enough to show the cross her mother had sewn into her undershirt. She had not screamed, not even when he'd placed the harness over her ribs and cranked it tight until she couldn't take a full breath without shaking. The mechanism he'd designed was based loosely on a baptismal font he'd seen years ago in a European sketchbook, a wooden cradle for infants designed to tilt gently under the priest's hand. He had modified it, replaced the wood with iron, fitted a funnel above the mouth. It released water in measured drops, not fast enough to flood the lungs all at once, but steady, cold, and unrelenting. He wrote that it mimicked the passage of sin from the body. Each drop eroded the will. The ritual was not to cleanse, but to consume. She lasted 5 hours. Not because her body resisted, but because he adjusted the incline every hour to keep her from slipping into unconsciousness. He noted when her lips turned blue, when her toes curled against the iron. He studied the way she choked, not on panic, but on restraint. The way she tried not to weep. He had seen men cry at the sight of broken fingers, but she only blinked back the water in her eyes and muttered prayers through clenched teeth. He had not expected her strength. It thrilled him. When her heart finally stopped, he stood over her for a long time, not out of guilt, but admiration. He reached out and closed her eyelids with a gloved hand, then whispered, "You were obedient until the end." Her body was not disposed of immediately. He kept it suspended for another day, measuring post-mortem swelling, watching how her lungs deflated, recording the rate of skin pallor in damp conditions. The room grew colder, but he refused to stoke the fire. He wanted to know how long the flesh would remain pliable in river-chilled air. The next morning he boiled her under the floor in the lime vat used to strip machine oil from iron fittings. He watched as her bones lifted from the froth like softened nails. When the town asked again where she had gone, he produced a signed letter. He forged her handwriting with impressive accuracy, claiming she had taken work in Peoria with a cousin. The priest read it aloud to the parish, and though the congregation sighed in sadness, they nodded with relief. "She was always too bright for this place," someone whispered. No one thought to check the postmark. No one remembered the iron shoes left drying behind the furnace. That week the wheel was cleaned and re-oiled. The water flowed more evenly, as if her body had been a blockage. The workers returned to their posts. Her absence became a quiet corner of memory, something polite people no longer mentioned. But the owner had already begun planning the next trial. Her death had proven the method. His journal's margins filled with sketches, revisions to the funnel, notes on weight distribution, thoughts on how different body types might affect the duration. He called it Trial 1, Mechanical Immersion, and at the top of the page he wrote, "More subjects required. Baptism is insufficient. Resurrection requires design. No one ever found her. No one asked again." The mill turned, the river ran, and the town looked forward. But beneath the wheel, something had changed. The machinery had tasted its first life, and it would not be the last. He never repeated a method. That was the first rule. Each worker who vanished became something distinct, a lesson stitched into the machinery, a reflection of how their labor could be turned against them with surgical clarity. It wasn't rage. It wasn't punishment for disobedience. It was order, a meticulous rebalancing of flesh and function. To the mill owner, they were not just workers, they were cogs meant to operate with quiet precision. and when they sang or questioned or smiled too brightly, he saw it as rust. Corrosion in the system that had to be corrected before it spread. The disappearances began to outpace the explanations. A torn apron here, a misfiled name in the ledger there. He did not panic. Instead, he adjusted his rotation. He started choosing from different corners of the mill, alternating between genders, ages, and tasks. It was an algorithm of absence. And with each disappearance, he made sure the body vanished more completely than the last. Not to hide them, but to demonstrate to himself how thoroughly a person could be erased from memory if no trace remained to argue against it. Isaac was first, an older man whose sole job was to sharpen the mill's blades, the ones that sliced sacks, scored wood, trimmed belts. He was careful, methodical, quiet, the kind of man who whistled only when no one was nearby. The owner watched him for weeks, noting the way he tilted each blade to catch the light, the way he ran his thumb along the edge without ever bleeding. Precision like that must be preserved, he wrote in his journal. The method chosen for Isaac was slow. A wooden press designed originally to flatten wool for packing was modified. The rollers were fitted with hidden ridges, not enough to slice, but enough to crush. Isaac was offered wine that night, told it was a reward for excellent performance. He awoke with his arms strapped above his head, legs locked into iron tracks, his back against the first press wheel. The owner whispered as he turned the crank, "You made these blades with care. Now we return the gesture." It took nearly 30 rotations before the bones began to break. By then, Isaac had already bitten through half his tongue. The flour was sifted later. No one tasted the difference. Then there was Ruth, 19, thin as a cord and just as quick. She worked as a cleaner, scrubbing the floors and railings between shifts. She hummed old hymns as she moved, not loud, never disruptive, just enough for her voice to drift between walls. Her songs made others feel safer. That made her dangerous. The owner marked her as melodic interference. The method selected was auditory correction. In one of the locked rooms below, he had prepared a chair fixed with restraints and a long steel arm designed to guide a funnel down the throat without piercing the esophagus. Ruth was gagged only briefly. He needed the humming to match the pitch. He dropped the nails in one by one, each forged to a slightly different size, like keys on a piano. She choked and swallowed and tried to scream, but the sound only bent higher as her windpipe collapsed. When her eyes dimmed, he recorded the harmonic decay, noting how the shape of the human throat distorts under pressure. He kept the nails. They were cleaned and placed into a small glass case labeled Resonance Error. He never let the rooms fall silent afterward. He believed that silence bred forgetfulness. So he played back recordings, faint mechanical reproductions made with bellows and tuned rods, echoes of screams and gurgled hymns. These were not kept for pleasure. They were data, evidence of the human body's capacity to reflect its labor in its own undoing. To him, the method was the message. Every death had to prove something. Every corpse was a theorem tested. And still the town said nothing. The mill's output had increased. Wages arrived on time. The mayor toured the outer halls and declared the factory a model of modern progress. Parents reminded their children to work hard, show respect, and not wander the halls alone. Rumors swirled, yes. Whispered fears passed over barrels and bread counters. But no one confronted him. No one dared. The owner made sure of that. He published a monthly notice that listed departed workers as having relocated to better jobs in distant cities. He forged goodbye letters, paid off the postman, and planted stories of opportunity in Chicago and St. Louis, even as far as New Orleans. It worked. People wanted to believe they lived in a place where hard work was rewarded, not devoured. Below the main floor, the ledger grew heavier. The owner began categorizing deaths not just by profession but by symbolic match. A belt runner who'd once tried to flee was strapped to a pulley and spun until his arms tore from their sockets. A clerk who overcounted wages was sealed into a press box where the sound of coins dropping on metal was echoed by the snapping of his joints. Each one fed the ledger, each one proved the system worked. He believed the body could confess through pain what the mind would never admit aloud. He did not seek repentance, he sought harmony. To him, the mill was not just a machine of gears and belts, but of flesh and terror. The more he fed it, the more perfectly it ran. He wrote in his notes that the mill had begun to respond, that certain sounds now echoed back with unnatural timing, as if the walls themselves remembered. He considered this a sign of success, that his design had moved beyond control into transformation. By spring, 5 workers were gone, all filed away as relocated, each with a tailored death method tied to their trade. No bodies, no funerals, just names removed from the roster and folded into the ledger's pages. The rest of the workers began to speak less, laugh less, linger less. They arrived early, left quickly, and avoided the eyes of the man who owned the wheel. The mill was no longer just a place of labor, it was a system of correction. And no one wanted to be the next lesson. By the 5th disappearance, the town could no longer pretend that everything was fine. It wasn't just a bad season. It wasn't just men chasing opportunity. There were too many mothers waking in the middle of the night to empty rooms. Too many wives waiting beside windows with arms folded, eyes fixed on the road that never brought anyone back. At first, the excuses had come easily. Maybe he found work in Chicago, maybe he got sick and didn't want to burden us, maybe he'll write. But days passed, then weeks. The letters never came, and all the while the wheel at the mill kept turning. The smoke kept rising. The wages kept flowing for those who still showed up. Women began standing together in the early hours, not speaking, just counting. They watched from porches and alleyways, tracking which men walked out of the mill at dawn, which ones stayed behind. They whispered names. They passed scraps of information like currency, who had been on the night shift, who had been alone in the West Hall, who had last spoken out of turn. There was no proof, no graves, no blood on the streets, only gaps, only silence where laughter used to be. Children braver than their parents in ways only ignorance allows, began saying strange things. That they heard voices in the wind near the mill, that shadows moved behind the windows long after the wheel had stopped. One boy swore he saw a woman's face in the steam rising from the grain silo. Her mouth open, her eyes white, no skin on her jaw. Another girl refused to walk past the storage building, claiming the ground trembled when she got too close, like something underneath was trying to push its way out. Parents hushed them, not because they didn't believe, but because they feared belief was the first step toward being next. Questions stirred, quietly at first. A clerk at the supply post asked if anyone had received letters from the men who'd left for better work. A preacher's wife muttered during prayer circle that she'd seen Ruth's apron still hanging by the back stairs, weeks after she'd supposedly gone to Springfield. But whenever these doubts reached the edge of confrontation, something pulled them back. The mill owner had a gift for smothering unrest, not with threats but with warmth. When whispers reached his ears, he did not deny them. He welcomed them. He threw a banquet. He invited everyone, workers, clergy, merchants, city officials, even two physicians passing through on their way to St. Louis. He had long tables set in the cleared workshop, lit with chandeliers ordered from the East Coast, their glass reflecting the firelight like stars. The food was rich, excessive, whole cuts of meat, baskets of bread, pots of stew that had simmered all day in the deep ovens beneath the floor ovens that had, only days earlier, rendered Isaac's limbs to ash. The workers knew, at least some of them did, but they still sat, still smiled, still drank the wine offered to them in silver cups, their hands trembling just slightly around the stems. The mayor raised a toast praising the mill's productivity, its importance to the region, the moral backbone it provided to a generation that might otherwise drift into idleness. The owner stood beside him, nodding graciously, eyes moving slowly over every face. He didn't speak long, only a few words. He thanked them for their loyalty, for their silence, for their unshakable trust in truth. And then he sat, folding his napkin in his lap as the fire behind him crackled like it was laughing. The physicians congratulated him on the cleanliness of the facilities, the order of his shifts, the way even the youngest workers seemed obedient and calm. They asked no questions about injuries, about turnover. One of them remarked, smiling, that the workforce seemed strangely consistent, like it had been designed. The owner replied with a soft chuckle and said, "Consistency is what keeps the wheels turning." The doctors wrote his words down as if they were scripture. And so the banquet worked, for a while. The whispers quieted. The workers returned. But something had changed beneath the surface. Trust had curdled into fear. Men avoided eye contact with the foreman. Women locked their doors before dusk. Children stopped playing near the mill fence. The silence that followed was not peace. It was paralysis. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one knew where to point the finger. Because the man they feared was still the man they owed. He had built the roads, the schoolhouse, the chapel roof. He had buried their dead, fed their sick, held their children. He smiled in church. He bowed at funerals. He kept a ledger of names and crosses no one else ever saw. To the town, he was a pillar. To the workers, he was a quiet executioner. They could not speak the truth aloud because it would mean everything around them. The bread, the jobs, the comfort was built on screams they never heard. And once you admit that, how do you go back? How do you shake his hand and say thank you so they didn't? They nodded. They worked. They avoided eye contact. And when another worker vanished the next month, they said nothing. Not because they didn't notice, but because they finally understood what happened to people who did. The mill kept running. The wheel kept turning. And the whispers, once loud enough to stir resistance, faded again into silence. A silence deeper than before. A silence that fed the fire. He no longer referred to them as victims. In the pages of his leather-bound journals, they were subjects, numbered, observed, and annotated with a precision that bordered on reverence. Each name was scratched out after the experiment concluded, replaced by a 3-digit code and a short description. Subject 023. Vocal fold collapse during harmonic ingestion. Total duration, 3 hours, 41 minutes. Notes: significant resistance, likely due to pre-existing religious fixation. What others would have called cruelty he described as calibration. Every cry, every muscle twitch, every blued fingertip was a variable tested, recorded, and fed into his understanding of control. Pain, he believed, was a language, and he was becoming fluent. His obsession grew under the influence of men who claimed enlightenment. He read the writings of Dr. Benjamin Rush, underlined passages about moral discipline and the shaping of the mind through strict regimens. He studied European penal reformers who spoke of behavior molded by punishment. John Howard, Cesare Beccaria, and others whose theories on correction fascinated him not for their ethics but for their structural elegance. These thinkers, he believed, lacked only the courage to act. He would become their successor, a man who applied their ideas not in theory but in flesh. He built his operating space beneath the grain tunnels behind a reinforced door that workers believed led to the old storage bins. The room was windowless, sterile, lined in brick and soot with chains bolted into the walls like the spokes of a wheel. The floors sloped toward a drain. There were tables, too, wide and padded with old flour sacks, scorched black at the corners. He called this place the gallery. Here he transformed labor into experiment. He tested boiling steam first. Subject 017, a belt operator named Samuel, who had once joked too loudly during prayer, was selected for thermal endurance. The steam was piped through modified valves, carefully gauged to produce rapid blistering without immediate unconsciousness. He timed each twitch of the legs. He marked how long the lips held shape after the skin split. He described the screams as vocal data. When Samuel finally lost consciousness, the owner stood close enough to feel the heat rising from the scorched body and whispered, "Progress demands sacrifice." Next came Subject 029. A young man with an uneven smile who often sang at lunch. The owner had long theorized that the mouth held more behavioral cues than any other part of the body. He tested this by fitting the boy with a custom-made vise that clamped the jaw open while industrial pincers were used to extract teeth. Not all at once, but in measured intervals. One every 20 minutes. He listened to the rhythm of the screams, recorded their pitch, counted how many repetitions it took before the boy's vocal cords collapsed into gurgled silence. In his notes, he wrote, "Emotional defiance is centralized in the mouth. Extraction neutralizes resistance." But these were not just isolated studies. Each procedure was connected to the subject's original labor. That was his rule. If a man handled grain, his lungs were flooded with powder and chaff until they ceased to rise. If a woman worked the dye vats, she was submerged in alternating solutions of boiling indigo and frozen salt water to test circulatory resilience. He believed the very act of labor conditioned the body for its eventual undoing. It was not death. It was refinement. His journals expanded to fill 3 volumes. He began to structure them as chapters in a scientific manuscript, complete with hypotheses, materials, outcomes, and philosophical reflections. He did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as the first true anatomist of American obedience. "Europe gave us theory," he wrote, But this land was made for application. Each entry closed with a small, precise sketch, sometimes a limb, sometimes an organ, always drawn from memory. The mill became his laboratory, the workers his inventory. Even the machines were modified to suit his purposes. One press, retrofitted with hidden clamps, could crush the ribcage inward without disturbing the skin, allowing him to examine organ displacement post-mortem without visible trauma. Another chamber emitted a frequency so low it triggered nausea and vertigo in confined subjects. He used it to measure psychological unraveling over a 48-hour isolation period. He spoke to no one of this work, but he began to feel that the mill itself understood. He wrote that the walls held sound differently now, that the screams seemed to resonate longer, deeper, as if echoed by something beyond brick. He began to dream of voices rising from the floor, whispering in tones he recognized from previous subjects. He called these dreams residual harmonics and considered them a side effect of progress. He did not believe in spirits. He believed in consequence. Above ground, he still smiled, still tipped his hat, still kissed infants' heads at Sunday services. No one knew that he had tested cranial pressure limits on subject 037, a mother of 4 who once worked the looms. No one saw the bone fragments hidden beneath the floorboards. No one dared ask why the north furnace always burned hotter. To the town, he remained a man of vision, but in the depths of the mill he was authoring a new gospel, one written not in words but in skin and heat and silence. He did not ask for witnesses, only results. And as the journals grew heavier, he began to believe he was close to something final. The human body, he thought, could be perfected through labor. But the soul required study. It happened during the second shift, just before the river light faded. The wheel groaned, not the usual wooden moan that came with age or frost, but a deep, grinding cough that rattled the entire south wing. It shook the walls and silenced every conversation in midair. Workers froze, heads turning toward the sound like prey, sensing the presence of something older than hunger. The machinery halted. Belts snapped loose from their tracks. For the first time in months, the mill exhaled silence. It was unheard of. The wheel had never stopped, not once since its construction. Not through storms, not through flooding, not even when the river iced over. It had become a symbol of inevitability, of motion that could not be interrupted. But now it sat still, wedged into a growl that echoed through the beams like a growl from something buried. A team of workers was sent to investigate, their boots heavy against the stone floor as they descended into the lower engine pit, the part of the mill no one liked to speak of. The owner didn't go with them. He stood at the top of the stairwell with his arms folded, not concerned, not even curious. When asked what he thought might be the cause, he only replied, "Sometimes wood takes what it wants." Below, the men pried the side plates from the wheel casing. The light was dim and the steam thick, but within seconds one of them retched. Another backed away, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken since childhood. Tangled within the iron cogs were strands of hair, tufts of cloth, something pale and slick that squirmed like sinew. A shard of jawbone wedged between 2 gear teeth. Fingernails pressed like coins against the base plate. There was no full body, just remnants, as though the wheel had consumed someone completely, ground them into pieces too small to gather. The men knew instantly what they were looking at. They didn't speak the name. They didn't ask where the rest was. They just looked at one another in horror and then up the stairs to the man who stood watching them with eyes that did not blink. He descended slowly, then calm as always, inspecting the mess with no more emotion than a farmer examining a spoiled root. He asked no questions, issued no blame. He simply said it must have been an accident, that someone must have slipped, fallen, gotten caught. Tragic, he muttered, but inevitable. He told them to clean it. Ordered steam poured over the gears, scrubbing brushes fetched from the dye rooms. He even helped for a moment, sleeves rolled, hands in water, as if to prove his concern. But they noticed how his fingers lingered on the bone, how he turned it over, admiring the smoothness of what had once been part of a skull. The remains were not buried. They were shoveled into the ash pit behind the grain ovens and burned before sunrise. No name was recorded, no shift was altered. By morning the gears turned again, faster than before, quieter. The workers said nothing aloud, but a change passed through them like sickness. Some avoided the wheel entirely, rerouting their tasks. Others whispered that the machine had tasted something, that it had been hungry and now it had been fed. A few claimed they'd heard voices in the grinding, not screams, but moans, as if the wheel was now breathing, dragging air through invisible lungs shaped by the death caught in its teeth. The owner's journal entry for that night was longer than usual. He wrote, "Integration successful. Organic residue reduced, friction beyond expectation. Motion smoother, energy conserved. Subject 041, unplanned sacrifice yet optimal." He circled the word optimal twice. He began testing how other fluids interacted with the wheel's mechanics. He drained animals first, watched how pigs' blood soaked into the wooden troughs. He recorded how it clung to the gear teeth, how it steamed when pressed into motion. Then he moved on to human blood, collected during his experiments, poured into the grooves at night. He swore the mill moved better, as if it recognized its new purpose, as if it responded. The workers knew the truth, even if they never spoke it. They began marking themselves before entering the mill. Chalk crosses on the neck, rabbit's feet in coat pockets, nails tied to strings and hidden under shirts. Old ways, superstitions from grandmothers and farmhands, things whispered on porches after too much drink. It didn't matter if they believed them. They needed something, because something had changed. One man, a veteran of the engine room named Wallace, said he'd seen the gears twitch before his hand touched the lever, as if the machine anticipated him. Another woman claimed the grain flow no longer followed gravity but pulsed like breath. One night, a boy, barely 12, screamed and refused to enter the west corridor, saying he saw a face in the rivets. They sent him home. He never returned, and still the owner smiled, tipped his hat, attended every burial where no body was present. He hosted another supper, this time in honor of the man we lost, though he never spoke the name. The workers sat in silence, food untouched, eyes fixed on the floor. He raised a glass and said, "Sacrifice fuels all progress. It is the law of nature, and nature, as we know, does not waste anything." Some began to wonder aloud, not in public but in barns and alleyways, whether the mill was alive, whether it had been built to do more than produce flour, whether they were not just workers but offerings. And though they whispered, no one left. Because the mill paid well, because the river still flowed, because to leave would mean starting over somewhere colder, hungrier, more uncertain, and because some of them, whether they admitted it or not, had started to feel something strange when the wheel turned. A pull, a weight, like something deep inside them was being wound tighter with every rotation. It began with the siren, not the one used for fire or flood, but an older one, rusted and forgotten, mounted on the far roof of the mill where no one had touched it in years. It wailed without warning, a long metallic cry that pierced the late autumn sky and dragged townsfolk from their beds. Dogs howled, children sobbed, mothers opened windows in silence, searching for smoke, for light. For some reason, the air had begun to taste like copper. But there was no fire, no storm. Only the mill, its windows glowing faintly, its wheel turning faster than anyone had ever seen. The workers had already been herded into the silo rooms. 40 of them, men who had ended their shifts at dusk, taken their bread, washed their hands, and prepared to walk home. Instead, they were led past the main stairwell, past the dye vats and gear pulleys to the lower grain silos where wheat was stored for drying. The doors were shut behind them. Iron locks slid into place. At first they shouted, then they pounded, then they heard the hiss. Pipes along the walls released steady streams of water, cold and choking, rising inch by inch. It wasn't the speed that terrified them. It was the precision. The water filled the space methodically, never splashing, never rushing, always climbing. A few tried to stack sacks against the door, others tried to break the slits in the walls, but nothing held. The silos had been built to store grain, to hold pressure, to survive storms, but now they held lungs, bones, voices. Their screams did reach the town, faint like a wind moving through wet trees, but sharp enough to make people stop mid-step. Some said they heard words, others just moans. A few began walking toward the mill with lanterns in hand. But then the siren stopped. The lights went out, and in the stillness that followed, something ancient settled over the town. Not silence, but agreement. No one stepped forward. No one knocked on the door. They turned and walked home one by one, lanterns dimming behind them. By morning, the water had receded. The silos were emptied. The doors reopened. No bodies remained. Only soaked cloth, a shoe, a locket with initials carved into the brass. The floors were scrubbed clean before shift. Grain was packed as usual. When a mother asked where her son was, the foreman told her he'd taken work in Rockford. She nodded, but she didn't ask again. The owner wrote nothing of that night in his public ledgers, but in his private journal the entry was long and calculated. Group induction trial. Response to entrapment varied by age and station. Flooding produced optimal compliance within 17 minutes. Unified silence achieved. Demonstration successful. He did not list names, only body counts. He added a final line. Observation. Town now understands the cost of interruption. But the water had only been the beginning. The following week, the looms were reconfigured, not visibly. The cloth still rolled as expected, the needles still flicked, the belts still turned. But beneath the machinery, new iron hooks had been welded into the beams. Chains were measured to length, pulleys fitted with locking clamps. Women, those who worked the evening textile shift, were summoned one by one under the pretense of instruction. Some resisted, others followed without question. All were bound. The shuttles were lowered across their backs just above the spine. Each motion of the loom dragged the threads across skin like wire. With every shift, their bodies were pressed harder into the wooden slats until skin broke, then muscle. One by one, they were carved by cloth, a punishment fashioned to resemble work. The owner stood above them, watching as blood pooled beneath their feet. He said nothing, only nodded at the rhythm. He called this method loyalty engraving, wrote in his journal that discipline etched into the dermis anchor's memory longer than fear alone. He measured blood loss by weight, timed how long each woman remained conscious, noted which ones recited prayers, which ones wept, which ones were silent. The workers watched, not just the women. The others, nor the men in the dye rooms, the boys at the presses, even the janitors, were made to observe. They were not allowed to turn away. They were told it was an efficiency demonstration. They stood, hands behind backs, as the shuttles ran, as flesh tore, as cries turned to whimpers. None were allowed to leave until it was done. Afterward, each woman was returned to her station with bandages and silence. No doctor was called, no report filed. When asked what had happened, they looked at the floor. Some left their tools behind and never returned. Others came back the next day, slower, stiffer, eyes fixed on nothing. Word spread without sound. There were no more jokes in the mill, no laughter, no conversations during lunch. The air grew heavy, the machines louder. People moved like ghosts, not because they wanted to die, but because they had seen how easily death was repurposed into ritual. The town understood. This was not about punishment anymore. It was about theater. The owner had crossed from secrecy into spectacle. Each death was now a performance, each act of torture a message. The mill had become a cathedral of control, and its congregation bowed lower with every sermon. Still, they came to work, because they had to. Because to stop showing up would be noticed, and being noticed meant being next. The mill wheel turned, the chains clinked below. And though the screams had stopped, the echoes remained, stitched into the floorboards, into the walls, into the muscle memory of hands that no longer trembled, only obeyed. It wasn't a single name that broke the town. It was the count. One morning, an old widow marked her calendar and realized her neighbor's boy had been gone for 5 weeks. That same evening, a baker's apprentice whispered that the girl who once swept the floors had vanished without even collecting her final wage. A shopkeeper, sharpening his blade beneath oil lamplight, realized he hadn't seen his brother since the harvest. The names began to stack, quiet at first, passed hand to hand like hidden debts. But each name added weight, and soon the silence that had blanketed the town for so long began to split. It was the mothers who led the charge, not the clergy, not the mayor, not the men who had once shaken hands with the owner and toasted to the future. It was the women who had waited too long at doorways, who had scrubbed dried blood from them collars and told themselves it was rust. They gathered in the square with empty buckets, lanterns, shovels. No speeches were given, no permission was asked. When the mill doors refused to open, they shattered the glass and climbed through. What they found was not a factory. It was something older, colder, built on order, but pulsing with something far beyond logic. Behind the storage rooms were walls that rang hollow when struck. The women pried at the seams with iron bars, tearing away boards until the walls fell inward to reveal spaces never meant to be seen. hidden rooms with rusted hooks, each bearing numbered tags. Piles of aprons folded neatly, each still stained in places where bleach would not reach. Ledgers stacked in rows, sorted by method, some marked complete, others awaiting second trial. In the largest chamber, bones, dozens of barrels arranged like offerings, femurs and finger joints wrapped in twine, skull caps etched with notes crushed under press, steam reaction successful, vocal loss achieved within acceptable window. Each barrel bore a label, yield successful. The smell was thick, not just of death, but of long-dried purpose. The air did not mourn, it catalogued. One mother collapsed, another screamed, but most just stared, mouths open, hands trembling, some sinking to their knees. They had feared cruelty. What they found was craft. The deaths were not wild or erratic. They were measured, engineered, studied. This had not been madness, it had been method, and the man behind it all was gone. The mill owner had vanished, his quarters were empty, his clothes still folded, no notes left behind. Only one door locked from the inside, the chamber where the wheel's base met the heart of the mill. When it was forced open, all they found was a long coat, folded atop a steel basin, a boot, a handkerchief with initials stitched in blood-colored thread, and beside it a set of open manacles, empty, but stained. The drain in the center of the floor ran red. Some believed he had fled, that he boarded a train east, changed his name, and carried his journals to Europe, where they would be welcomed under brighter lights and cleaner walls. But others swore he never left, that he had offered himself to the machine, fed his own body to the gears he had oiled with so many others. They said the sound of the wheel had changed that night, grown lower, slower, as though digesting something large and final. Strangest of all was what happened after. The workers left, the mother sealed the doors, the mayor declared the mill condemned. And yet, the wheel kept turning. No one powered it. No one fed the furnaces. But each morning the gears would creak to life. Belts would twitch. Levers would clatter as if moved by unseen hands. The river did not run fast enough to explain it. And yet the mill ran just as it always had, its pulse steady, its purpose intact. For 3 days it moved without command. On the 4th it slowed. On the 5th it groaned, a final shudder like breath leaving a lung. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was different, not the silence of fear but of aftermath. The kind of silence that hangs over graves too wide to fill. The town didn't hold funerals. There were no bodies to bury. Only barrels of bone, ledgers of method, whispers of names never said aloud again. They burned what they could, threw the journals into the river, collapsed parts of the mill into rubble, but no one touched the wheel. It stands still now, years later, rusted and vine-wrapped, but intact. Children are told not to play near it, birds do not nest on it, rain does not wash the stains. Some nights the air around it hums just faintly, a rhythm too steady to be wind, as if something still waits for the gears to turn again. They tore the mill down piece by piece, not with ceremony but with quiet shame. No photographs were taken, no plaques were unveiled, just men with axes and chains pulling brick from brick, lowering the great wheel into the dirt where it groaned one final time before splitting down the center like something long dead and rotted through. The iron was melted, the beams burned, the remaining bones, when those the town could not identify, were buried together in a plot with no names. A priest blessed the ground, voice trembling as he read from scripture. No one cried, most just kept their heads down, tools in hand, as if destroying the place required silence equal to the suffering that once lived within its walls. But the ledgers, they couldn't burn those, not all of them. Some were too detailed, too structured, too horrifying to ignore. The town council sent them east, to legal minds and lawmakers who had never seen the mill, never smelled the blood in its furnace, or stood in the rooms where nails had been swallowed like communion. And those lawmakers, pale-faced and shaking, made changes. Within a year, Illinois passed its first restrictions on child labor. No worker under 13, no shifts beyond 10 hours, and every industrial site required unannounced inspections. Factory owners grumbled, but inspectors arrived anyway. Clipboards in hand, eyes darting toward basements and locked doors. They asked questions, they counted heads. They ran fingers along the walls looking for seams. It wasn't enough to stop the worst from happening again, but it was enough to make men think twice. Still, no one ever cited the mill by name. It was simply referred to in records as Incident 1841A, as though giving it initials could drain its weight. The journals were boxed and sealed. Some say they sit deep in state archives. Others whisper that certain chapters were smuggled overseas, traded among those who collect what should never be read. A few believe the pages were buried in the foundation of a courthouse, beneath polished marble floors, where justice would one day be handed down over the buried blueprints of cruelty disguised as science. Years passed, then decades. A memorial stone was placed outside the town cemetery, small, gray, unadorned. It bore no names, only a single line. To those who labored and never returned. Flowers were left now and then. Children dared one another to touch it. Elders sat near it in the spring, staring at the ground as if waiting for something to rise. But no plaque told the truth. No statue was raised to show the chains or the clamps, the boiling rooms or the silence that had held a town captive. The memory lived not in bronze but in breath, in the way the people paused before they spoke of work, in the way certain streets grew quieter after dark, in the way old men still watched the river and flinched when its current turned too fast. And yet, beneath all of it, the legacy endured, not in stone, not in law, but in method. Because the man who built the mill had not just killed, he had systematized death. He had proven to himself, to the silence, to history, that evil did not need a scream to grow. It only needed repetition, record-keeping, precision. He had written a scripture of obedience carved into ribs and mouths and lungs, and though his name was struck from every document, the structure remained. The idea that cruelty could be scaled, that horror could be made efficient, that if you dressed it in numbers and wrapped it in industry, no one would call it what it was until it was far too late, and perhaps worst of all, he had looked so ordinary. He had attended church. He had smiled at infants. He had spoken softly and carried a handkerchief for widows. He never screamed, never hit, never cursed in public. He looked like any other man. He prayed with the same voice he used to record the time it took for vocal cords to rupture. He blessed bread from the same ovens that scorched skin from bone. He quoted scripture as he measured breath rates during water submersion. He did not wear a mask. He wore normalcy, and no one thought to question it. That is the story that was never printed in textbooks. That is the legacy that haunted more than the mill's crumbling stones. Because if a man could do all that, not in a war, not in a dungeon, but in a workplace, what else could be hidden behind factory walls? Behind spreadsheets? Behind smiles? The mill was destroyed, but the idea behind it was not. And now you know. What do you think? Could this happen again?